Amen. Lesson 19, Jesus and the Sabbath. Uh, we are now starting to look at Jesus' second year of his public ministry. Jesus' personal ministry is frequently stated to have lasted 3.5 years, which is really an educated guess based on the belief that the Gospel of John mentions 4 Passovers. John definitely mentions 3. We find that in chapter 2, 13, 6 and 4, and 13 and 1. And the 4th reference to a feast of the Jews, which is found in the very first verse of chapter 5 of John, which is going to be our text, suggests that that may have been another Passover. The exact length of Jesus' ministry was not important enough for God to reveal exactly. In other words, we cannot state categorically that Jesus' ministry lasted 3.5 years, when the Scriptures do not say that. We can, though, say with certainty that we know that the ministry of Jesus was at least 2.5 years in length, with a probability of 3.5. As Jesus continued his work in Galilee, his popularity increased. Crowds grew bigger and bigger, came to hear him preach and to seek his healing. Here's the thing, too. Perhaps most significant during this time was the increased hostility of the Jewish leaders towards Jesus. We know that spies followed him everywhere, trying to discover some basis for accusing him. We're told that in Mark 3 and 2. When Christ escaped his enemies' traps, it filled them with rage. Luke 6 and 11 tells us that. Matthew wrote that the Pharisees conspired against him as to how they might destroy him. We read that in Matthew 12:14. Mark in 3:6 tells us the same thing. John recorded that the Jews were persecuting Jesus and that they were seeking all the more to kill him. That's in our scripture, chapter 5 of John, verses 16 and 18. So a question, let me ask you. Why did the writers of the gospel accounts think it necessary to document the irrational hatred of the Jewish hierarchy? Any thoughts on that? Well, one might think that they were trying to justify what they were doing. Yeah, perhaps they wanted to clarify their part in the crucifixion of Jesus. Brian. Right. They ignored so much. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's what they were wanting. Yep. Exactly right. See, one of the things to remember, there was no greater shame uh, existed in the New Testament than the disgrace of dying on a Roman cross. Remember, we talked about it many, if not mostly all the time. They were no clothes, naked, when they crucified him. How embarrassing. How embarrassing. Both Hebrews 6:6 and 12:2 talk about that shame. Now, it's interesting that the antagonism or the hostility revolved around Sabbath regulations. The gospel accounts tell of 6 Sabbath controversies. We're going to study 3 of them in this section and see what Jesus did to counter, to some extent, the effects of the opposition. Helps when you don't skip a page. I got smart. I numbered my notes in the lower left-hand corner so that if I don't see the right number come up, I know. Anyway, what does the word Sabbath mean? Rest. Yeah, when God created the world, He rested on the 7th day, Genesis 2:1 through 3. Later, the 7th day rest, called the Sabbath, was given as part of the 10 Commandments. And I know we all know this, but let's turn over to Exodus 20. And we're going to read verses 8 through 11. And again, I'm going to call on people. If you don't want to read, just shake your head no. But if you do, please read loud. Mark, would you mind reading the first part? 8 through 11. Okay.
Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. The seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. It shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the Sabbath day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
Thank you. Yeah, the Sabbath was the day of rest, a time to reflect on God, a time for rejoicing. To ensure that the Sabbath was observed, God imposed severe penalties for violating it. Numbers 15, 32 through 36, Nehemiah chapter 13, Jeremiah 17. What was the penalty for violating a Sabbath? Death. Yeah, in the account in Numbers, a man was stoned to death for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. See, God's laws were sufficiently strict, but men were not willing to leave it at that. The regulations evolved to include such ludicrous traditions as these, and it's hard for me to believe this. A nailed shoe could not be worn on the Sabbath because that was a burden. One man could carry a loaf of bread, that was okay, but two men carrying the loaf of bread between them was not. Wait. Uh-huh. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's exactly right. See, we find that the Mosaic restrictions had been elaborated and multiplied until they numbered into the hundreds. And many of these, like Wayne said, were utterly ridiculous. I mean, the wearing of false teeth. Didn't even know they had false teeth back then. Okay? Uh, Ladies, plucking out of a gray hair. No. Picking a head of wheat. Writing two letters together. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. These multiplied regulations had made keeping of the Sabbath practically impossible. They couldn't keep it either. No way. The whole system had destroyed the very spirit of the Sabbath. In Roper's book, Warren W. Wiersbe observed they had taken the Sabbath, God's gift to man, and had transformed it into a prison house of regulations and restrictions. What a way to explain it, right? As the Jews attempted to entrap Jesus, their observed and complicated rules became their favorite piece of legislation. Since, as we just mentioned, for all practical purposes, no one could keep all of their Sabbath laws perfectly, they thought they would have no trouble catching Jesus in a violation. And of course, such violations carried the death penalty. Wayne. That's right. That's right. Yeah, we're going to see a little bit later on that they just went way out of bounds with it. Way out of bounds. We'll get to that. Good. Any other questions on the introduction here? Okay. Let's look at our first case. Jesus heals a crippled man on the Sabbath. Let's see. James, would you read for me, please? James 5, the first 9 chapters. 9 chapters. 9 verses. 1 through 9. James 5, 1 through 9, please. Did I say James? John. I got you on here written. I just can't read. John 5, 1 through 9. I'm sorry. Yes, please.
These things was the feast of the Jews, Jesus traveled to Ripon. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, 5:40. And these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered, waiting for the moving of the waters. For the angel of the Lord went down in certain seasons and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring up of the water, stepped in, was made well of whatever disease with which he was afflicted. A man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there, and knew that he had already been a long time in that condition, he said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your pallet and walk." And immediately the man became well, picked up his pallet, and began to walk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We see here Jesus has been busy in his great Galilean ministry, but now he took a break to go to Jerusalem for this religious feast that we read in verse 1. See, remember that the law of Moses required Jewish men to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year for major feasts: the Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of the Tabernacle. And we know that Jesus always kept the law. Matthew 5:17 tells us that. So while it is uncertain which feast this was, a good case can be made for this being the Passover. You may remember during the previous Passover, Jesus had enraged Jewish religious authorities by what? Cleaning the temple. Yeah, chasing those religious merchandisers, the money exchangers, boom, out. And at this Passover, he infuriated them by healing a man at the pool of Bethesda. Look at verse 2. Again, it says, "Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches." Sheep gate. What does that mean? There's some confusion over that. Could this mean simply a gate to bring sheep in and out of? Yeah, yes. The answer is, I think so. More than likely. You see, the Greek word for sheep, and I mispronounce this, but probatike, Probatike, as good as I can get, which literally means having to do with sheep. We know that a sheep gate is mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 3 and also in chapter 12. Now, if John and Nehemiah were speaking of the same place, it was a small opening in the north wall of the city, not far from the temple grounds. Now, this would make sense. Presumably, sheep were washed in the pool before being offered as communal sacrifices. So that would make sense that they would have a gate to bring them in and out. The shelter of the 5 porches was apparently the gathering place for many of Jerusalem's disabled, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. They would gather in the shelter of the porches, waiting in hopes of being healed by the curing powers they believed that the water possessed. Now notice in the last part of verse 3. I'm going to begin reading it. And these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed. Do you see an asterisk before the word waiting? Anybody in the Bible see an asterisk? 1, 2. Okay, that means there's a footnote. And in my Bible, as you drop down at the very bottom of the page, it says in chapter 5, verse 3, the NU omits the rest of verse 3 and all of verse 4. Now, I don't know what NU means, so going to my abbreviations in the front of my Bible, it says this about NU. The electic Greek text in the 26th edition of the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament, N, and in the 3rd edition of the United Bible Society's Greek New Testament, U. Don't have any idea what they all mean. But obviously it's a translation that does not include the last part of verse 3 and all 4. It was noted in the supplemental reading that the second half of 5.3 and all of 5.4 are omitted in the oldest and best manuscripts. Now, why do you think this is so? Or why do you think the words were added? Wayne.
You may recall that when we were studying how we got the Bible,
Right.
that in the transcribing of the translations, century over century after century, there either became new evidence available about the manuscript. Remember that there were actually notes that the scribes had written into the scriptures that maybe were not inspired, but the translators were very careful about not including. And as time has passed, as we have become more acquainted or more educated in ancient manuscripts, then the Bible, the different versions of the Bible have been updated to make sure that it reflects what the most accurate information is regarding the translation.
That's exactly right. What I wrote here is more than likely the lines in 5.3b, the last half, and all of verse 4 were first introduced as what is called scribal glosses, reflecting a popular belief about the reason for the water's disturbance. See, so what is a scribal gloss? It is where main text of a work is explained by adding text, or they call it glosses, either between the lines or in the margins of the page. Okay? In this case, though, we see in verse 7 that the water is stirred up. Sir, I have no man to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. But how is it stirred up? So in their efforts to answer that, they came up with this idea. See, people thought that the periodic stirring of the waters was caused by an angel, and that the first person to enter the pool after this occurred would be healed. Okay? The lame man believed that there was power in the water, though the pool played absolutely no role in his healing. But he believed it. So if you omit 3b and 4, there's no biblical evidence that any angel actually stirred the water. How would you answer it then? Well, the disturbance may have been caused by the intermittent bubbling up of a natural spring. Is one way to answer it. We don't know. We know that among those gathering around the pool was a man who had suffered with an infirmity for 38 years. Anybody had anything bother them that long? Wayne? Yeah, it's not fun. And he was lying there basically helpless. It is not said what his infirmity was, but it was apparent that it was some form of paralysis or lameness, since he was not able to go down into the water quickly enough without help. Notice the last part of verse 7. Water stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me. We call that in elementary school cutsy. Boy, they got in front of me and don't like cutsy, people who cut in line. We see in verse 6 that Jesus saw the man lying there and knew how long already he had been in that condition. Now, Jesus' question to him, do you want to be made well, may seem strange at first. After all, wouldn't everyone surely want to be well from a condition like that? I mean, think about it. That was the reason the man was there in the first place, right? Yes. Okay. There's no evidence of that. Okay. The way the writers did the scribal gloss to try to explain the stirring of the waters. And that they chose to explain it as an angel stirring the waters. Well, it's omitted in the original and best manuscripts. It was later added, as Wayne has said, to try to explain certain things or as more knowledge became. I'm not saying it's not true. I mean, go ahead.
There's no other information in the Bible that would support that particular thing happening.
Right.
And so what they're saying is that since it wasn't found in original manuscripts, in all the original manuscripts, then it is possible that that information, that those verses were added because of scribal notes rather than inspired scripture.
Good explanation. Yes.
So is it right to assume then that maybe, or is it wrong, or I'm kind of lost here. Trying to understand, what I've always read was that the waters were stirred up, and then it says that an angel came, stirred up at a certain time and seasons, and that's why they were there. That's why the paralyzed or so on was going in the water and healed. So because somebody's saying that there's no evidence anywhere else, it's possibly that it didn't happen.
That's the way I understand it.
I mean, there's a lot of things in the scriptures that are one-liners that you don't hear or read about anything else to get and take them for what they are, because the Bible says it.
Right. And I guess the best way to explain this is that's, to me, is not a critical part or piece of information that is needed to understand what was going on here. I mean, the man believed that an angel did that. Okay? He never got in the water, obviously, because Jesus healed him for him. So, okay. James. Yeah. Okay.
I don't want to get into a political discussion here, but we have to remember that culture has a great influence on what we believe.
Yep.
And so, and it's fine not to, it's fine not to think one way or the other regarding this scripture, because you're right, it is not critical to what Jesus is trying to teach.
Right.
But let's not be naive enough to think that culture could not have shaped that man as well as every other person's ideas about the power that was in that pool. Because it was not, I mean, it's still going on today.
Right.
All of the, we say, drinking the Kool-Aid that goes on regarding things that have been created within the culture that influence people's thinking.
That's right. And when you go on, and we can discuss this more, and the question that Jesus asked, do you want to be healed? It really is a good question. Because if the man was to be healed, he would have to make changes in his life. Sin had been in his life, and we know that by reading verse 14. Afterward, Jesus found the man in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you." Are the two tied together? Maybe. The lame man's answer to Jesus' question in verse 7 indicates that he did not regard Jesus as one who possessed any kind of healing power. Look at his answer. He says, "Sir, I have no man to put me in the water," because he believed the water had the healing powers, if you will. The healing properties of the water were believed to extend only to the first person who entered the pool, and since people would cut in front of him, the man could only complain about his position in life. His healing would not be because of any faith in Jesus as a healer, for unlike the royal official that we've talked about, the nobleman, this man displayed no faith. This man displayed no faith. Jesus tells the man in verse 8, "Rise up, take up your bed, and walk." It goes on in verse 9, "Immediately the man was made well, took up his bed, and walked." Now, John adds, and for me it's in the last part of verse 9. Some of you, I believe it's in the first part of 10, says, "And that day was the Sabbath." He made a point of saying that. Okay? Any thoughts or questions so far? Yes, Wayne.
Maybe that's why no one would pick him up and put him into water, because it was the Sabbath.
Could be.
And so what the Sabbath had become to everyone.
It was interesting, though.
Well, I just think John made that point though for a different reason, which is coming up.
Right. The form of the phrase suggests that this was not the weekly Sabbath. Okay? And I didn't know this, but a special feast day, as we talked about in verse 1 of chapter 5, that was treated as a day of rest, regardless of the day upon which it fell. All the feasts fell into this concept of being on the Sabbath. It's interesting. I didn't know that. Then, beginning in verse 10, we see the confrontation starting to begin. Jack, would you mind reading in chapter 5, verse 10 through 16?
So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, "It's a Sabbath. It is not permissible for you to carry your pallet." But he answered them, "He who made me well was the one who said to me, 'Pick up your pallet and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Pick up and walk'?" The man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "Behold, you become well. Do you not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and informed the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well.
Thank you. This account marks the first open hostility towards Jesus, recorded in John's Gospel. It's interesting that the Synoptic Gospels record a number of instances where Jesus' activity became the focus of a dispute. And I think we could all say it's fair to say that the conflicts between Jesus and the Jewish authorities over the Sabbath contributed to the desire that they had to kill him. See, the Jews reminded, and this is so, to me, tells the story of what the Jews were like. The Jews reminded the man who had been healed that it was unlawful for him to carry his bed on the Sabbath. They were not concerned about the man and his good fortune, but about the Sabbath traditions. They paid no attention to the wonderful and helpful deed that Jesus just performed for a man who had been lame for 38 years. Wow. They should have been thrilled that the man had been delivered from 38 years of suffering, but all they could do is only think of the Sabbath violation. Sad, huh? See, the Sabbath appears to have been Jesus' favorite test case regarding the traditions of the Jews. We remember originally God gave the Ten Commandments, and after these, they were enlarged by the Jews to 613 rules and restrictions. You turn 10 into 613. Amazing. 365 negative, 248 positive. Then, in addition, they added countless other restrictions upon those that ended up being impossible burden to keep. Impossible. The laws concerning the Sabbath in particular had gotten so completely out of control with so many absurd distinctions, the Sabbath became something God never intended. Turn over to Mark 2, please, verses 27 and 28. Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Lord of the Sabbath. See, the result of the healing was now a face-to-face confrontation with Jewish authorities. The religious leaders accused Jesus of breaking the Sabbath, and look at his response in verse 17 and 18, or verse 17. But Jesus answered, I said, "My Father is working until now. I myself am working." In other words, it is true that God rested on the seventh day. Now, this is important. But this does not mean that God ceased to do good. And that's the key, I think. Even on the Sabbath, he sustains the universe, right? He sends sunshine and rain. Jesus' argument was that since God helped people on the seventh day, it was all right for him, Jesus, to help people on that day. Thoughts or questions, comments? Yes, sir, Brian. Uh-huh.
Big declaration in my mind. Jesus proclaiming his deity.
Yeah.
Lord, Sabbath, you can find the Sabbath. We looked at Exodus, Deuteronomy. It's there. It's one of the Ten Commandments.
Right.
Even the will of God himself to Moses. If you're saying you're in charge of the Sabbath, you're saying you're God.
That's right. And we're going to see later on that just more outrages them. Okay, when we get into the witnesses. Okay. See, Christ's words enraged the Jewish leaders, for they saw the implication. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Toby. Yeah, sure. And worshiping God is just not on Sunday and Wednesday. I mean, it's every hour, every day of the week. Oh, we do. Yeah. Doing good will never get you in trouble, I think. Yeah. We saw here where Jesus' words enraged the Jewish leaders. And here's the reason. For they saw the implications of his argument. In the first place, he said, "My Father." And men normally spoke of our Father. Okay? But Jesus said, "My Father," implying a special relationship. In the second place, Jesus pictured God and himself as being involved in the same activity. My Father is working, and I myself am working. Verse 17. And of course, as a result, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him because he was calling God his own Father and making himself equal with God. We see that again in 17 and 18, as Brian pointed out. Any thoughts or questions? Now, in verses 19 through 30, we see Jesus saying that he has equality with God in power and authority. Jesus' basic premise was this, that he and his Father were united in what they did. His equality with God did not mean he was competing with God. Okay? He stressed the Son can do nothing of himself. Look at verse 19. And again in verse 30, he says, I can do nothing on my own initiative. Jesus gave several examples of how he and his Father were united. In verses 21 through 30, three themes keep coming up, reappearing, overlapping, if you will. Number one, the giving of life. Number two, raising the dead. And number three, judging mankind. See, the Jews thought the above was God's prerogative only. But Jesus boldly claimed that he and God were co-workers in these areas. Look at some examples. Look at verse 21. It says, "For as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will." Probably here is referring to spiritual life, but it also could include physical life, right? Look at verse 24. And this is certainly spiritual life. "Most assuredly I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life, and shall not come into judgment, but has passed from death into life." See, Jesus predicted that the Jews would see him perform greater works, marvels, miracles, that they had seen before, and that they would be in awe, marveled. End of verse 20. And when you think about the raising of Lazarus from the dead. We'll see that later on in John chapter 11. Pretty amazing, right? Pretty amazing. But we got to remember this, that Jesus' power went beyond raising a handful of people from death during his stay on earth. Look at verse 25 and 26. Here we're talking about the second coming. "Most assuredly I say to you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself." We know that Jesus and God are united in judgment. Look at verse 22. "For the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son." Then drop down and let's read 28 and 29 together. "Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation." See, Jesus insisted that God gave him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. Verse 27. Again, he claimed, "I judge and my judgment is just." Verse 30. So, question. Let me ask you this. Since Jesus and his Father are united in giving life, raising the dead, and judgment, what should the response of his listeners have been? Wayne.
I was just thinking of verse 23. I think verse 23 is one of the most important verses in this whole chapter, because it said that all should honor the Son just as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Just as those listeners should have honored him as much as they did God, so today there are religious groups that honor God, but don't even give Jesus
Time of day.
thought.
Yeah.
So they are sinning. I mean, because they are discounting who the Son of God, the Son of Man, was and is to all Christians.
That's absolutely. Here's my answer. Christ said, read verse 23.
So you nailed it. Yeah, that's exactly right. There you go. There you go. We see in this last section we just studied that Jesus made some incredible claims of power, authority, and relationships, right? He now would be forced to either offer proof of what he was saying was true, or he would have to retract his statements. And unfortunately, we're out of time. So we're going to pick up there on Wednesday and look at the impeccable credentials that Jesus brings forth and writes about, or John writes about. Thank you so much.